Okay, so this session is going to focus on population health management, and I know that that was the theme of our day, but we're going to go into particular detail around some of the ways you can put population health management into action. So just a reiteration of the definition that we had up earlier from Gary. This is the NHS England definition. However, we think that it has quite a lot of applicability at a UK level based on our engagement with customers. This very quickly is a definition from Orion Health. Now, you can hopefully see from that definition that there is quite a lot of overlap in some of the themes with the NHS England definition. So an aim to improve clinical health outcomes, the ability to use analytics to get down to define cohorts and groups, use of care coordination, and also key to all of this is patient engagement. Now, coming off of each of those points, we've highlighted certain bits of Orion Health capability, which some of you will be more aware of than others, but we're going to go through some of that today. So as part of the session, we're going to have a large focus on workflow. Engage will be covered by Anne later today, so I will not steal her thunder. And Kevin will join me later to tell us about intelligence and analytics. So a quick point around population health management at a high level, and talking to the population health management continuum. We see here that we're divided into 4 different categories. And at Orion Health, we look to provide solutions at each of those where it's relevant to the specific use case. Ultimately, though, we're trying to get to the point that Brad was putting across earlier, trying to get the right care to the right patient at the right time. So just a reiteration of the 3 pillars of population health management as outlined by NHS England again. Gary referenced infrastructure, and I think the morning sessions really covered that in quite a lot of depth from our perspective. Again, today or this afternoon, we're going to talk to intelligence and interventions. So from an Orion Health perspective, the shared care record was what we looked at earlier. Again, a reiteration that intelligence and our analytics capability Discover we'll look at the back end of this session, and we'll soon go into workflow, medicines and problems, and with Anne, a piece of patient engagement. Another thing that we're mindful of in terms of our PHM aspirations is alignment to the market, hence the references to some of the collateral put out by NHS England. We've also taken note of what good looks like, and we think that there are a lot of points here, specifically around point number 7 and health populations that we're aiming to deliver in the solutions that we're going to talk you through now. So, the current road, as you can see, the current road to population health management, and I'd like to just start, these are Mark's slides, so I'm going to do my best with them. The current road to population health management has got potholes and it's quite squiggly, a bit like spaghetti. So the point here being that it's not always clear and it's not always straightforward to get to true or accurate or good population health management. Now, from a current state perspective, population health management is managed through paper and apps. Now, that requires manual updating, and also that will often sit outside of a clinical workflow. That might involve use of notebooks. It might also involve use of spreadsheets. So, again, spreadsheets are wonderful, but one of the challenges, it requires manual update. And also spreadsheets very, very quickly can fall out of date. As soon as there's been an update or if it's been saved locally, you don't know what the latest version of that information is. Electronic lists can also be very, very valuable, but where they are siloed and not integrated within your platform, you don't know how up-to-date or accurate that information is or if it's pulling upon the latest information. BI equally, if it's not fully integrated within your workflow, can also have shortfalls. Go on to the next slide. Okay, so one of the priorities from a clinician's perspective, as we understand it, is the key is to be able to find your patients and to be able to prioritize and ascertain who is next. Who do you need to see, finding the right patient at the right time to give them the right care. And that is an ongoing cycle that we wish to deliver or enable clinicians with our platforms to be able to achieve. So, no coincidence, the Orion Health Road, Andy, I can see you're impressed, is going to be straight and clear, and we're all going to know where we're going. But on a serious note, I guess the solutions that we're going to talk through hopefully will provide simple ways to get on that journey towards population health management. Another slide that you've seen already today, aligning our maturity model to the three different pillars: infrastructure, intelligence, and interventions, and then working from bottom to top. They are some of the capabilities that we offer. So again, just at a summary level, from an infrastructure perspective, we enable the bringing together of data sets through our shared care record and through medicines, and also through Engage. We can also align intelligence through our analytics product Discover, of which we'll touch on a bit later. And also we can begin to use our Coordinate capability, and also to an extent intelligence and medicines to enable interventions. Okay, so just diving into some of that capability in a bit more detail. This is a slide showing how we can use analytics as a means of deriving different patient lists and identifying cohorts of patients from data persisted within our platform. So this is an example of an out-of-the-box Discover dashboard that has been developed by our team. And you can see that this dashboard is being filtered on breast screening tests that are required. Now, using that particular filtered data, we can derive a list, and also we can filter that list of information to bring back patients, in this instance, within a particular age range. Now, using that data, we can create a work list within our platform. From that particular work list, you can then evolve that work list. So at the moment, when you bring that back from a dashboard within our Discover platform, it will come like that in 2 columns. But for those of you who are familiar with our collaborative work lists, you can add different columns, add different measures, capture different data within that particular list, so that you can capture the information that's relevant to the use case, of which we'll touch on one shortly. The other benefit of capturing that data in a collaborative work list is it means that users across the shared care record can work in that collaborative work list, add and remove patients, and edit data in that collaborative work list. And also they can use it as a trigger potentially to add a patient to a care pathway or to complete a form for that particular patient. So if I go on to the next slide, here is an example of a collaborative work list that has been configured once the cohort's been defined. So you can see here within that particular product, we can add multiple columns that are relevant to the use case. In recent versions of the product or the solution, we've been able to add shared lookups as well. So you now have drop-down functionality to add more structured data directly into the list. Previously, that was just date and free text data that you could add in. As I mentioned, from a workflow perspective, you can then use that list as a prompt to enroll or add someone to a care pathway. And that care pathway could be associated to one single form, or it could be multiple forms according to a more complex workflow. And just here is an example of a form being completed within the shared care record by a clinician. Now, the other point around our care pathways capability is we have the ability to be able to manage forms according to a workflow. So using some of our capability within the product, we can either make a very, very, very simple workflow, one that consists of one form, or one that might consist of 7 or 8 different forms that are all sequential, that rely upon the completion of the one prior to then move on to the next step. So we have that flexibility within the solution. And that's an example of essentially transposing a Visio diagram, for example, into our capability. The other area which we're going to touch on, and that will probably come later in today's session, is we're also, from a patient engagement perspective, ensuring that you have the ability to input data from a patient perspective. So within our Engage Patient portal, there are patient forms now available within the platform, which have a nice, neat UI that the patient can be prompted to complete. We also have standalone patient forms, but I'll stop on that, Anne, because you're going to cover that, which enable patient completion of forms without Engage Patient portal as well. So going back to the population health management continuum, I wanted to give an example of a use case that was from here. We worked with Tracy very, very closely about 18 months ago to deliver the CIC. Now, this slide, right. Mark's put this slide together. I'm taking no credit for this. Joss was Tracy's former colleague at Connecting Care, and she came to us, I think Tracy came to us as well, about 2 years ago, saying that the Community Integrated Care Bureau required a transfer of care solution to enable the discharge of patients out of an inpatient facility into a community bed in a very, very short time frame. So they had funding available up until a certain milestone, and they needed to prove that a solution would be live in their platform and being used, I think it was by the end of January 2021. So we had 7 weeks to deliver it. Orion Health, I've put in brackets here Mark's his slide, and he definitely said it. He said, make sure we have access to your stakeholders and we'll be able to deliver that for you. Deborah, who was one of our key stakeholders as part of the project, question mark, and he was adamant that we could deliver the project. So, Community Integrated Care Bureau, a bit of background. For simplicity, CICB. They are a discharge rehabilitation coordination service, and they manage the discharge of patients from hospital into a community care bed. Once those patients are discharged into the community, they're added to one of 3 different pathways, and those pathways are, which pathway you're added to is based on clinical severity. Managing those 3 pathways are 3 different hubs: Bristol, South Gloucestershire, North Somerset. And also involved in that process are Sirona, who manage the overall process. There are community health and local authority teams, and also hospital teams who are prompting or initiating parts of that process because they're working with the patient in the hospital who is then ready for discharge. Some of the challenges that that team faced before our engagement was that each of those 3 hubs were managing that process and administering it as best they could, but they were using different means and different technology to do that. So some were working in Excel, some were capturing data in GP systems. The point being that a lot of that data was offline. No one knew what the latest version of that data was. And also it was very, very hard to report across each of the 3 hubs to understand the status of patients and where information was. So as part of our engagement, as part of the 7-week engagement, we worked with them to deploy a workflow solution. Now that involved building upon the existing shared care record that Connecting Care have in place that we heard about earlier today. And it involved setting up one single form, which is a CICB tracking form. Now, what we used that form for was to capture information related to the patient in their journey out of hospital into a community bed. So it would capture initial referral information, everything through to which pathway they were going to, and then which community setting they were going to. So that CICB tracking form would be updated at incremental basis as the data for that patient evolved. To support that process, we set up 24, I think it was 24 we ended up on, collaborative work lists. Now what those collaborative work lists would do for Sirona would give them a view as to where that patient was in the process. So at point of referral, the patient hadn't been added to a pathway, they were still in the hospital. So we had a series of collaborative work lists that essentially acted as waiting lists. Now within the form, once the information was available, the user would add the referral information, the pathway information, and also highlight which hub that patient was going to belong to. And that from there, they could then begin to put that information into the form, which would then make them appear on different lists to denote where they were in the process. So those lists supported from a workflow perspective and from a process perspective, the CICB process. Using the list, they could also export to Excel the information, and also we provided a series of 8 RBAC groups to support the solution to make sure the right people could see the right lists and right information. Here is an example of the form that we created. It was one form, as mentioned, and it was updated iteratively, and we put a series of rules into the form to make sure that the process would work. As I mentioned earlier, the solution logic was driven from the form. So where the patient was in the process was outlined in the collaborative work list based on the data input to the form. And here we used the workflow within care pathways to drive that process. Here is an example of one of the collaborative work lists that we set up, and as you could see, it gave up-to-date information across all organisations at the right point in time. So here's a few statistics from CICB. We achieved the go live within 7 weeks, and by July of 21, we had over 1,700 patients registered with 160 users in the application. Recent statistics tell us that the solution is still live, and that there are 368 people in a rehab bed and 412 on one of the waiting lists that I referenced. And there are some of the estimated benefits, I hope that's okay, that we associate with that particular solution. Okay, a few slides on how we did it. Let's just jump down here. Okay, so to get through the process, we did some as-is mapping and creation of some initial project artifacts, and we used that as-is to inform a straw man of the solution. Now, in parallel to that, we worked through some of the commercials work, and also did any of the technical debt associated with the solution that we were needing to deploy. In order to get feedback from the users in a timely basis, we did 3 two-hour sessions whereby we could show mock-ups of the solution and get quick and easy feedback of that solution. That's how we got from initiation in middle of December to go live in January 21. Now, because of that quick process, I think a point was made earlier about trying to achieve good rather than perfection. We had a post-go live monitoring activity and process whereby we did performance monitoring on the solution and made some enhancements, and also did some new versions of collaborative work lists to support some of the functional elements which required improvement. Essential to this process was good and pragmatic collaboration with the local stakeholders. I don't think we'd have achieved this in the timescales that we've outlined without the excellent engagement from Tracy and the team, and also Sirona and the local authorities. Now, this is our Empower framework. We didn't just do this in a hurry. We made sure that we kept to this structure that many of you will recognize, but we built into it some agile principles. So the build and review process, use of daily sprints, and also ensured that we still adhere to some of the connecting care testing requirements, managing testing through their dev, pre-production and production environments as we readied the solution. So, just about our process a little bit. The reason why we've adopted this agile approach, I guess, is because sometimes the design will take you off in one path and the user experience is something very, very different. So those regular check-ins enabled us to ensure that we were going in the right direction. And also it prevented analysis paralysis. And I guess a good example of that is the underground. It started with one line, I think in about 1860, the Met line going from Farringdon or Liverpool Street, I think it was, through to Paddington, and then it's evolved into what it became today. But no one would have thought that that's what it was going to be on day one. The approach to prototyping that we used was a way of making sure that we got regular feedback so that we could enhance the solution. Some of the benefits behind that approach, it meant that change management started on day one, that users were engaged in the software and what we were building from a very early point, and also ensured that clinicians bought into the process more readily because they knew what it was they were getting and they could inform what we were developing for them. Some of that rapid prototyping took place literally through a 24/5, 24/7, 24/6 window. But we certainly went through a process of providing a prototype to the end users in the daytime UK time, providing that feedback to our New Zealand colleagues who led the development overnight, and then receiving that feedback first thing in the morning. And we went through that process quite intensively for a few weeks. The benefit of this approach is that hopefully we end up with a final product by regularly engaging and checking in and not just setting the endpoint and then going at it, despite the natural direction of the feedback that you're receiving. Okay, now I'll hand over to Mark Rainford for some global innovations. So the principle behind that solution and some of the other ones I'm going to show is it's a form and a list. Again, Mark's slide, simples. But I guess it's just trying to indicate how easy it is for us to pull these solutions together and how quickly and easily they can be deployed. So to give you a few examples, using the same principles or basis in the US, in North Dakota, we did a newborn screening solution. At NCHIP, we did a child milestone tracking solution, tracking milestones for children ages 0 to 6. And more recently in Ontario, we've met a series of use cases using that very, very simple but repeatable and effective approach. And you can see some of those use cases referenced there. Another patient forms example, this time from Southern Cross, is use of a form, but in a patient context to provide pre-admission information so that they don't have to fill in a form at point of arriving at the hospital. And an example to show some of our meds and problem list capability embedded was Justice Health, which I believe Aaron Jackson, who you heard from earlier, will have led upon. That enables the management of medications for Justice Health in New South Wales. And I think if you want to hear more about that, Aaron would be the best person to catch up with outside of this session. Here's just an illustration of some of the solutions that we've put together using those same or similar principles. Now, not everything I've just shown you there is just a form and a list, but they are the basis of the things that we're pulling together. Okay, right, now a few slides on local innovations. So to inform some of that stuff, we have conducted quite a lot of customer engagement, aimed to adhere to national strategies where we can, so the long-term plan, for example, and also key on our minds is standards adherence, in particular those of the PRSB from whom we heard from earlier. So, for example, we've recently engaged with them to discuss palliative and end-of-life care plan standards. So I'm going to talk through why we think that's a good idea and some examples. So using the shared care record as a basis, we think makes a lot of sense because you've already got that in place, and also it provides a location for multidisciplinary users to come to a platform that you can build upon, reducing system silos. We're proposing a repeatable approach, so that kind of form and a list approach to all of the solutions we're putting together with consistent artifacts irrespective of the use case. Now, the reason for us trying to be consistent in this way is that we can promote collaboration between customers and create reusable products that really add value. Again, a key principle locally is change management, and I refer back to the success we had at CICB. Without that, we wouldn't have been as successful as we were. Here's a very, very, very simple illustration of how that workflow works. Enrollment of a patient, a series of forms are made available that are completed as required by the use case. That data can then be surfaced on a collaborative work list in a Discover dashboard or into the CDV tree, for example, or if required, pushed onto an onward system such as a GP system. A couple of the use cases that we've prototyped, we're looking into end of life, and with some of the customers here today, we've mocked up a treatment escalation plan, and we've also taken information from some of the other standards outlined by NHS England. I guess the current solution inclusions are a list, a collaborative work list, a pathway, and associated forms. Again, it's that simple. We're using very, very similar principles for a virtual ward, using the COVID ward SOP that came out last year as a basis. And also we're understanding some of the different use cases that feed into that, from step up to step down. It's certainly not always COVID use cases that a virtual ward might have applicability. Frailty and respiratory is probably COVID in practice, but frailty is certainly another use case that we've identified. And at the moment, again, that solution is still made up of a list, a pathway, and supporting forms. We're also including in that a dashboard from our Discover platform so that you can have operational reporting against the status of the virtual ward. Long COVID is another one we're looking at a global level. The reason why we've highlighted it here is because of some of the inputs to that solution are UK based in terms of what's informing the makeup of it. But again, similar principles apply. Here is one that's been deployed heavily in Scotland. This is our e-transfer of care solution, again led by Aaron, also known as IDL. This solution is still pathways and forms based, but I guess it's worth calling out because it involves medicines reconciliation and allergies work as part of the process of conducting the IDL process. So this is more involved and informed than simple form and a list, but it shows how we can still follow that same workflow principle to provide solutions, in this instance for our Scottish customer base. And a very quick slide on our roadmap. Just want to call out a few points. So in the near term, I've mentioned COVID virtual ward and care plan. We're nearly there with those. We're looking to the About Me form and providing that and making that available out of patient portal soon, along with some supporting IDL focused enhancements. From a patient form perspective, we're looking to enable remote monitoring in the near future. We do have remote monitoring capability and use cases in the past, but we want to bring that into line with our forms technology. And just a couple of other points in some of the rows further down, collaborative worklist calculated columns. So I mentioned some of the enhancements we've made to that product, but the ability to do calculated columns should be quite helpful from the perspective of being able to ascertain how long a patient's been on a list. So if you can calculate the patient from date of addition to a list to the current date, which we're doing functionalities to support a certain use case in Canada at the moment, that will make the applicability of a collaborative work list to monitor patients, especially in a virtual ward context, a lot more valuable. And now I'm going to hand over to Kevin to talk about intelligence.
So my name's Kevin Ross. I'm Director of Research at Orion. So I look after some of the products that really annoy our sales teams because you can't quite have them yet. So I'm here to kind of get you excited about things that are not quite ready for prime time, but things that are really exciting on the roadmap, some of which are a lot closer than you think. So we in the intelligence team are really focused on just adding that extra level of precision into Orion's products. So all of the things that you've seen throughout the day, really, particularly what Bruce is focused on here as the building blocks for really well-managed population health. So we've seen how you can understand a cohort of people at a really high level, and then what the goal is to essentially get to mass personalization. So being able to give the right care to the right person at the right time means understanding the data about that person as well as you possibly can. And that enables all sorts of these tools that we've already seen to just work that much better. So if you can understand the relative risk of one group of people, you can treat them differently. If you can get in under the hood and really understand their own records, you can do so much more for an individual, which leads to better outcomes for the individual, which leads to better outcomes for the system. And so we're really all about just adding that level of precision into the way that we interpret data. Now, Orion is a health data company. So we specialize in bringing together health data, and it's always been our goal to then take that data and use as much of it as possible to give the right care to the right person at the right time. So I'm going to talk about some of the areas that we're focused in on doing that, and in particular, a few of the sort of focus areas that we have within this sort of intelligence team. So we call it Orion Health Intelligence. It's a group of people who are mostly data scientists. So those are people who kind of have that combination of statistics and programming kind of in their background. They pull together, what do we know about this data? What can we do with this data that is a little bit more precise or sort of targeted than what we'd normally be able to do? And because of that, a part of what we do is research and services. So it's not always a finished product that sort of does everything for everyone. We send our data scientists out to work with customers to actually figure out how well they understand their own data, what could they be doing with that data to better manage their population and provide better care. And so a big part of what we're doing is actually going out, spending time with customers, understanding what's there. Off the back of that, we do have a number of products, and again, these are those products that are sort of in the works, starting to be released. Early versions are out there in a few customer sites around the world. I'll focus on three of them today. One's de-identification, another is the management of algorithms called the Algorithm Hub, the other is Smart Coder, which is our natural language processing. So de-identification is one of those areas that when we first set up a research team within the organisation, we recognised was a massive gap. So we always wanted to get our hands on data. Data scientists live and breathe data, and it's really difficult sometimes to get your hands on health data because it's personal and it's protected. So what we actually ended up doing is building a real knowledge expertise around how do you de-identify data in a way that builds trust and allows us to release that data to data scientists or to others who might want access to that data where you don't actually want to release any personal information. Now, de-identification at one level sounds really simple. You cross out people's names and addresses and they're not identified is sort of the first level. That was what we experienced as a research team is we would ask for a data set, say, please make it anonymous, give it to us. The first thing that my team would do is try and find themselves in the data set. And they could always do it because you only need to know about 2 data points. I had this procedure at this place on this date. Hey, that must be me in there. And I can find all those other things about me as a result. And we quickly realized that what was common practice was not very safe practice. So what we actually really dug into is how do you look after data in a way that really enables people to do really good analysis, and so we get the value out of the data, but protects the people whose data is in that repository. And that's where we've developed a capability around our de-identification, where we're having the ability for someone to do that trade-off. How much do I trust the person I'm sending the data to? How much value do I want to get out of it? And you've got to be quite clever about this. You do things like, shifting all the dates by a certain amount so that the gap between any 2 points doesn't change. You don't get some strange lengths of stay or those sorts of things happening. Aggregate up or down appropriately with different groups and in a way that you can kind of re-identify if you have to, because you might be using it for care. But you want to do it in a way that has enough people that look relatively similar that you couldn't re-identify them. And we had to get into some really difficult, detailed things here. So one of the things that happens when you try to aggregate up is you often try to almost take out the information about groups that are underrepresented. So by the nature of that kind of process, minority groups who tend to have a small number of people with unique health experiences, they often get lost within the data once it's de-identified. And so we found that we were getting a biased data set that wasn't actually representative of those who were most vulnerable in the community. So we have to do some really clever things about, instead of deleting cases or aggregating, actually create some dummy cases that look like those other cases. So you've got, you still can't figure out who's who, but there's some other things in there that just make it a much more clever way to actually do that. I've spent a bit of time focusing on this because I actually think this is a really huge value opener for our health customers around the world. There is so much value in health data, and we are way behind every other industry that I've worked in terms of ability to use that data and really deliver that mass personalization that you see in retail or banking or all these other areas. So again, this is something at the moment you can have our de-identification sort of capability on the back of what's called Discover, which is our population health analytics. But we have other versions of it coming for research and for releasing data in different ways as well. Second area that we've spent a lot of time working on over the last 5 or 6 years is understanding algorithms and their use and potential use in someone's health care. So we're all familiar with different sort of risk scores that are out there, even just straight calculations that are often done in quite different ways in different organizations. We went to one of our health customers in the region in New Zealand and asked them, well, they did an audit of the different algorithms that were being used. And they found that there were about 30 different algorithms that they didn't even know about that their clinicians were using. And the reason they sort of came to these situations is that someone would read a paper and find out, oh, this is best practice. I'm going to write an Excel spreadsheet or a piece of code or something like that, and they'd start using it as part of someone's care. And then eventually they'd sort of hand that off to someone else, and it'd start becoming sort of general practice. It turned out that over half of the algorithms had errors in them when we actually looked at what was happening, because people, they're not computer programmers writing these. These are clinicians who are busy and they've got a student to do it on the side or something like that. And so they had all of these sort of algorithms that were being used to provide care for people but had never had any audit, had never had any review, were not being maintained at all. And so we realized that there's a real opportunity to help organizations like that by having a suite of algorithms, standardizing them, going through a good review process. And I'll tell you a little bit about one of the particular uses we've come to in New Zealand with this. Third area that I am really excited about, and Chris gave a precursor of this, I guess, in the smart search illustration, is our area of natural language processing. So this is helping our computers essentially to understand the text that is stored throughout medical records. And we all know that in someone's medical record, things like the discharge summary or the referral letter or some sort of a summary of care or that free text field is often the most important insight in terms of someone's care. It's the summary often that is used. It's the field that people use as part of that sort of, this is the most important piece of information and I want to bring it to your attention. So we realized that throughout Orion Health's products, we have all of this text quite hard to get your hands on. So Chris talked about search being one of the main reasons for that. That's one of a number of use cases actually for wanting to be able to find valuable information within text. There are other areas, there are people employed in most health providers that their sole job is coding. So they go through records and add codes after the fact. Often happens in places in order to get reimbursed the correct amount for what's happened or to keep a track of the different conditions that have come through the hospital. We've also seen a lot of cases in population health where you're actually aiming to find a cohort of people that meet a special set of conditions. And those conditions are often a combination of things that are well known about people's age and demographics and perhaps their conditions that they have, but there's some unstructured information about them that you might want as well. So perhaps there's a new medication that's available or a clinical trial that's coming up or a new program that the government's offering, but they're offering it to someone who meets very special criteria. That's often something you can discover by searching through the text. So all of these are kind of examples where it's a really laborious process to go through lots of notes and find out who is eligible, who meets this criteria. And what we're doing with our Smart Coder product is essentially adding the smarts to our platform so that you can actually have the computer do a lot of that interpretation and a lot of that exploring for you. So we see this as a bit of a game changer over the coming years, that this is mostly going to be a back end that you won't even see. You might not buy a smart coder, but you'll see things like search being able to find things much more powerfully, or when you go for a cohort management kind of product, there'll be the ability to search the text as well as the structured information. So huge value coming out of natural language processing through smart coding. Let me give you 3 quick examples of where our intelligence team have got involved in some really interesting projects in the last few years. So one is a high-risk maternity project that we did. This was with an insurance company in the United States. They were particularly concerned at the number of people that were experiencing difficult pregnancies, and that includes both the mother leading up to the birth, but also obviously problems during the birth itself and for the child immediately after birth. They had a program that they had built up that was to support people who they knew were in a high-risk pregnancy kind of situation, but they didn't have any very good rules for figuring out who should go on this program. So there's a few basic rules they could apply, like a previous pregnancy that had had complications, but in general it was actually really difficult to identify who would benefit the most from this program. So what we were able to do, because of the Orion Health platform sort of being in place, is we could get hold of all the data that was available about all the most recent pregnancies in that area and identify what information do you have about someone, the date that you find out that they're pregnant. So again, it's all very well to have information about someone at different points in time, but you've got to know what do you actually know at a point where you could do something about it. So that at that very point, we could then say, is this person in the high risk category or not, and should we direct them towards this care? So we were able to sort of pull together medication information, previous health experience, all sorts of things about someone's health record in order to then look at historically who had had complications. Again, complications during the birth for the mother or soon after birth for the child, and build a model to actually predict who was most likely to experience those complications. Now, in the United States, for an insurance company, this is really big dollar kind of questions, because if someone ends up in the NICU unit, the neonatal ICU, it's incredibly expensive. So they were at one level interested in the cost benefit side of it, and they said, to be honest, if you found one person and helped them avoid that, this would pay for itself 10 times over, and we were able to find a lot more than that for them within the context of a project like this. So again, the key things to remember about those kind of projects is it's only worth doing if there's something you can do with the information. So the fact that they had a program that they could put people on if they were likely to be at high risk meant that we had an obvious kind of action to take. There's lots of really fancy data science and machine learning projects that we get involved in where people just want to look smart because they just want to find patterns in the data. But if you can't actually do something with that information, it's of very limited value. So we really look for those cases where you can actually take that insight and do something interesting and valuable for the patient as a result. We've been doing supporting a lot of the modelling work in New Zealand over the last few years for COVID-19. The most recent one that we've particularly been focused on as we've transitioned to having widespread COVID cases in New Zealand is prioritising who needs what kind of support when they have COVID-19. So in particular, we were interested, or the Ministry of Health in New Zealand were interested in how do we make sure that those who are most vulnerable get care as soon as they can if they test positive for COVID-19. And in New Zealand, if you test positive, you actually register it on a national platform. So we had pretty good data on positive cases in New Zealand, and we could link that with all of the other health records in New Zealand so that we could look at people's past history, everything we knew about them, and we could identify which people were ending up in hospital as a result of their COVID experience. And so we were then able to actually take that model, tune that model, and have a very accurate kind of view of sort of top to bottom risk patients in New Zealand. And that's being used within our call centres in New Zealand now, so that if you register your positive test, they run it through this model, and the call centre will call the top 10 or 20% of risk cases on any given day to make sure that they have the care they need and are able to avoid hospitalisation ideally, or at least know where to go if they experience complications. This actually has ended up part of something that we're really excited about in New Zealand, which is this thing we've called the New Zealand Algorithm Hub. So this is actually a nationally available library of algorithms that are used by the New Zealand health sector. So these are algorithms primarily related to COVID, but expanding into other areas as well. There's about 30 different models on there, and it's something that's kind of unique in its makeup. So there's 3 channels that you can use these models. You can go on the website. I think it's algorithmhub.co.nz. You could probably go from anywhere, and you can do a self-service. So if you want to put in a set of inputs and get an output for a given patient, yourself or someone that you're seeing, you can go there and do it in self-service. For our hospitals, we have a batch process where if you wanted to, for example, send all the patients that are currently in hospital at the moment and run a risk model for everyone and get that batch of scores back and put that into your dashboard, you can do that. But also an API. So the API means that anyone can build an app that actually calls these algorithms. So it doesn't have to be an Orion Health product. It can be your own app or your own kind of analytics product that actually calls this. Now, on one level, it's a technology solution that meets that earlier need I mentioned before, which is there's lots of algorithms out there that no one really looks after. But the other thing we had to do as part of this is build a governance process around it. So who gets to decide that this algorithm is appropriate for use by the New Zealand health system? There wasn't a group that actually asked and answered that question. So we had to put together a very esteemed group of people who had everything from consumers, clinical people, academics, sort of government, lawyers, every sort of different perspective that you might imagine kind of coming together and asking those questions. What do we think about declaring this to be a suitable algorithm for use in New Zealand? And in COVID, that's actually been quite difficult because we early on didn't have any cases of COVID in New Zealand. So we had lots of kind of questions around, would this model work for the New Zealand population where there are people who have different needs and different sort of makeup and different records about them. So we really had to think quite carefully about this. But again, this has really led to a real sort of position of being able to provide a whole lot of value to a lot of different organizations. So this isn't just in your hospital now, it's everyone in a GP practice or even in that sort of self-service world can actually access algorithms and use them. So I think I'm going to hand back to Bruce to wrap us up for the session.
Thanks, Kevin. So just a quick summary of what we've presented over the last 45 minutes or so. We've tried to give you an overview of Orion Health's response to population health management, but from a UK perspective. We're trying to be market focused in terms of customer expectation and also what the market from a NHS England and Scotland perspective are requesting. We think that we're well placed to support you because you're building upon the foundations you already have in place. We've talked you through some of the workflow solutions that we think will work well, CICB being an example, and also through our agile delivery approach and emphasizing the importance of change management in that process. And then, as we've just heard from Kevin, the ability to extend capability to incorporate intelligence.